Good day, folks. On behalf of ASSAf, I'd like to welcome you to the first of a series of webinar presentations where we are looking at some reflections on 30 years of democracy, especially some of the challenges, the successes, and obviously and most importantly, the prospects for the future. My name is Brij Maraj. I'm a geography professor at UKZN, and I'm the vice chair of the Humanities Committee of ASSAf, and I'm chairing the session today. Just some context and background. We know that South Africa's journey to democracy was characterized by struggle, protests, and resistance against the apartheid system. And we received a lot of solidarity and support from the international community to dismantle the pernicious system of apartheid. And we welcomed the new era of democracy in 1994 with great expectations. When some politicians glibly talk of burning the flag or scrapping the constitution, we should not forget that so many paid the ultimate price for the democracy that we currently enjoy. So as we reflect on 30 years of democracy, we need to look at this transition that we were going through, transformation from the apartheid to a democratic system. I think the most important, and this is obviously my personal reflection, facet of democracy is our Constitution, which was adopted in 1996 and is widely viewed as one of the most progressive in the world. And I think the most important is the independent judiciary. And purely from an academic and ASSAf's perspective, I think the entrenching of academic freedom and freedom of expression, which was curtailed and severely restricted in the apartheid era. We must acknowledge that inequality is a serious problem, social and economic inequality, the high unemployment rate is a challenge, and in some cases can be interpreted as a threat to democracy. And we now talk of a polycrisis in our country, especially in the post-COVID environment. So ASSAf is exploring a critical assessment of the transformation and challenges in different facets of South African life, looking at the gender dimension, looking at the challenges facing the youth, looking at inclusions of persons with disability, etc. And obviously, when ASSAf intervenes, we do so from the perspective of evidence. So it's scientific evidence. So we don't enjoy the privilege, the political privilege of rhetoric, etc. We have to defend our positions with hard science. And hopefully, I think that the policymakers and the government actually listen to the scientists in terms of how our science-based research can influence public policy. We saw that happening, for example, during the COVID period, where science influenced the different actions that had to be made. So there's a series of webinars. This is the first in a series of webinars. It's been advertised. I'll just indicate the titles. So today we're looking at critical reflections on 30 years of democracy amidst a polycrisis. I'll come back to that just now. The second webinar will be on youth perspective and the recent elections. Then we're going to look at gender and political participation and representation of women in South Africa, a very important topic. The fourth webinar will focus on equal participation and inclusion of people with disabilities. And then a critical one, open science and how it drives transformation and equity in South Africa. And then an equally important one, growth and status of science over the past 30 years. The objective of today's webinar, Critical Reflections on 30 Years of Democracy Amid the Polycrisis, is to review the achievements and challenges in South Africa since 1994, to analyze some of the current political, economic, and social challenges, to assess the resilience of our political institutions, the democratic institutions and structures. How can we safeguard democracy and, its ethics, accountability, and corruption? And then we want to look at some reflections on the future. I think before I conclude my brief introduction, it's important to acknowledge our speakers. We had 3 speakers, but one of the speakers has had some logistical challenges, and so we are reduced to 2 speakers. We have Dr. Stephen Gordon and Dr. Nkapeli Mkhunu, who are from the HSRC. I'll talk more about them later. And of course, there's Prof. Himla Sudhyal, who's the CEO of the of ASSAf. And I think I'll be failing in my duty if I didn't tell you about ASSAf, because sometimes ASSAf is not as widely known in the public domain as it should be. It's my personal view. So the Academy of Science of South Africa is an independent, non-profit organization that was established in 1996, and its mandate is to promote and advance science in South Africa. It serves as the National Academy of Science in the country, and it brings together leading scientists and scholars who provide expert advice on scientific matters and promotes science and research in South Africa, and is recognized internationally as well. So ASSAF's role include advancing science advisory in priority societal issues, recognizing and celebrating our democracy, and converging various stakeholders to create a platform for dialogue. On behalf of ASSAf, I'd like to thank the speakers who are offering their expertise and sharing their insights in today's webinar. And then, of course, there's a team that works behind the scenes in ASSAf to make this possible. And I would acknowledge the following colleagues from ASSAf: Raj Mahavir, Marvin Mandiwana, Kolani Mbiza, and Ms. Henrietta Wakana. I hope I got the pronunciations right. And with those introductory remarks, I want to kick off by introducing the first speaker. I'm just going to my notes here. Dr. Stephen Gordon, he's a senior research specialist in the Democracy, Governance, and Service Delivery Research Program of the HSRC, that's the Human Science Research Council. He has a PhD from UKZN, and I think I should put a declaration that I was a supervisor, and it's wonderful to see Gordon grow wings in so many ways academically. He publishes prolifically. I've heard his presentations and insights on radio and television. I think we're going to have a very exciting presentation from Gordon. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with everyone. Just give me 1 second. Thank you. Okay. Right. So if everyone can hear me, I want to bid a fine and hearty welcome to you all. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you here today. I'm going to be talking about the decline of electoral participation in South Africa, state society, and the sovereign. So as you know, we just went through a very exciting national and provincial election in South Africa, producing new and dynamic results. The first time the ruling party dipped below 50% in the last 30 years, indeed, not just below 50%, but almost below 40%, barely scraping above 40% in the national results, a truly historic and seismic change within our democracy. So one of the things we want to do here today is look a little bit more closely at that change, that shift in the context of electoral participation. And specifically, I want to talk about the quality and integrity of South African democracy. You'll be aware that the integrity of South African elections has been called into question. People are doubtful that the result of the 2024 NPE was a result of integrity. People are saying that this result needs to be challenged. There are court cases ongoing, and some political parties have not sent their members to parliament. So our challenge with democracy that we are having, this challenge to the integrity of our electoral system, is not new in terms of the global stage. So in many countries throughout the world, there's been a regression in democratic integrity in which people challenge election results, they challenge democratic values. We see the growth of authoritarian tendencies, not just in the global south, but in the global north as well. The Freedom House report from 2023 has noted 16 years of consecutive democratic decline. And indeed, in the last 5 years, we've seen, I'm so sorry, we have seen significant and somewhat disastrous erosion of democratic norms in a range of countries. And of course, important to remember that people in Africa are not themselves free from democratic recession. In fact, the vast majority of people living in the continent are not living in a free and democratic country. So we need to put our current democratic and electoral challenges in perspective. Now, one of the interesting things about the very, very dynamic 2024 NPE was that it was the lowest turnout for democratic elections in South Africa over the last 30 years. This is not, in fact, a new trend in South Africa. The 2021 local government elections was substantially lower turnout than in 2021 LGE and the 2016 LGE. Indeed, low turnout for the 2024 NPE is part of a long pattern of declining voter turnouts. So as the government of national unity looks to formulate its new policies and put together its plan for the next 5 years, it needs to give serious consideration to the need to strengthen turnout to maintain the integrity of South African democracy. Now, given these low turnout figures, we need to think very carefully about how South Africans think about politics and how those attitudes may have changed over time. So I want to use public opinion data to talk about this change over time. So specifically, I'm going to use the South African Social Attitude Survey, which has been fielded by the Human Science Research Council since 2003 and is an important tool for tracking and evaluating social and political attitudes. If we want, we can talk more about the survey and its various criteria, but I just want to remind our audience here today that it is a nationally representative survey of people 16 years and older, conducted in all parts of the country, representing old, young, black, white, rich, poor. Again, a very, very comprehensive, nationally representative survey that allows us to look in great detail at trends over time. So let us start with one of the most basic measures of public opinion and politics, which is, do you think the country is going in the right or the wrong direction? So this question was put to South Africans. at various points in time. So let's look at 2010. So we see here in 2010 that about half of the national population said that they were satisfied that the country was going in the right direction. Now, if you look at this graph, what you're going to see here is that I've segregated our data by people living in KwaZulu-Natal and people living outside KwaZulu-Natal. Now, why have I done this? Very, very importantly, we want to try and understand the nature of our country, South Africa, but also the dramatic change that has happened in KwaZulu-Natal over the last 6 months. If you paid attention to South African politics, you will have noticed that the ANC ran very, very comfortably KZN for several election rounds. And then in its latest election round, we saw a significant and dramatic change. Voters in KwaZulu-Natal moving away from the ruling party and towards the MK, the newly formed party by former President Jacob Zuma. To try and understand some of these trends, the data will be segregated between those inside KwaZulu-Natal and those outside, giving a perspective on how KwaZulu-Natal is like the rest of the country, but also those places where it differs. So let's consider how KwaZulu-Natal differs from the rest of the country. Firstly, we can see that the country as a whole became more negative about the direction that things were going between 2010 and 2023. I don't know why it keeps doing that. You can see that negativity increased substantially, people feeling that things were not going in the right direction. However, if we look at 2023, what do we see? We see that people in KwaZulu-Natal are much more negative about the direction that the country is going in than their counterparts outside KwaZulu-Natal. And this is going to be reflected in some of the other data that I'm going to show you here today. Look here at how satisfied are you with the general economic situation in South Africa at present. We can see here in 2007 that while not a large share of the country was satisfied, it was not too small. But as we move towards 2023, we see lower and lower levels of satisfaction. What's interesting about KZN is how dissatisfied KZN is. Only tiny shares of KZN are satisfied with the general economic situation in 2023, much lower than what we observed in the population as a whole. This gap really began to grow beginning in 2018 and has remained very consistent and very wide ever since 2018. Again, another trend we're going to see is that people in KwaZulu-Natal became much more negative, much more disillusioned with the status quo, really beginning in 2018. So here we can see again satisfaction with democracy. This very specifically is satisfaction with the functioning of democracy, not democracy as a general principle. As you can see in the period before 2018, we see the KZN and non-KZN were very similar. But then beginning in 2018, we see a large gap begin to emerge. Another important thing to take away from this slide here is that the general decline in satisfaction with democracy, the functioning of democracy, people are becoming more and more dissatisfied with how democracy is working, a growing disillusionment with the functioning of our democratic system. Now, this is bled over into dissatisfaction with institutions. Here we can see three core democratic institutions: national government, local government, and parliament. National government and parliament used to be very highly trusted in South Africa, with a lot of confidence invested in these institutions. But we can see that there's been a substantial decline in the level of trust in these important institutions. Local government, much less trusted, but very, very importantly, local government also substantial decline. You'll see the blue line is KwaZulu-Natal. The orange line is, of course, outside KwaZulu-Natal. Right. So as we can observe, KwaZulu-Natal more dissatisfied with national government, more dissatisfied with local government, more dissatisfied with parliament. Let's look at satisfaction with the current political leaders in South Africa. So beginning in 2011, we can see that a dissatisfaction was high, but less than half the national population was dissatisfied with national leaders, but it substantially grew, right? Particularly 2018 and 2023, we see the vast majority of people were dissatisfied with political leaders. Dissatisfaction with political leaders was especially high in KwaZulu-Natal, remarkably high, in fact. We look at 2023, 83% of adults in KwaZulu-Natal said that they were dissatisfied with current political leaders. Now let us move on to voting and voting attitudes. Now we want to talk a lot about electoral participation, and how people see the act of election participation. So firstly, let's look at 2004. When asked whether I vote or not makes no difference, vast majority of people disagreed with that statement in 2004. Right? In KZN, it was 71%. Outside KZN, 75%. But then we start seeing a slow decline in that disagreements. And it particularly, that decline is very, very large in 2023. 34% of people outside KZN disagree with the statement in 2023. 29% disagree with the statement in KwaZulu-Natal in that year. This shows and suggests to us very, very clearly that people have grown very disillusioned with the act of election participation. I want to show you here trust and distrust in the South African Election Commission. And this graph is very well placed, because what's driving trust and distrust in the South African Election Commission is, very, very importantly, their attitudes towards elected institutions and democracy in a very general sense. As trust in democratic institutions, as satisfaction with democracy declines, we see a consummate drop in trust in the South African Election Commission. Now, KwaZulu-Natal is not actually very different from outside KwaZulu-Natal in this respect, where we see fairly consistent numbers over time. But the most important thing here is the trend. Now, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about some work that the Human Science Research Council has done to try and understand this trend over time. In particular, two very important pieces of work have been done. A voter participation survey, which looks at public attitudes towards elections and the Election Commission in the run-up to elections in South Africa, and the Election Satisfaction Survey, which is a large exit poll which is conducted after people have voted. As they come out of the voting station, field workers interview them and ask them about their election experience. And I will talk to you a little bit about some of the results from this program of work. So firstly, the most important thing to understand is that people who've just had an election experience, they've just sat in line, they've voted, they've come out, they are very happy with the quality of their experience. When asked about, I'm so sorry, I don't know why it does this. I'm not sure what's going on there. When asked about election officials, the ballot paper, and the quality of that experience, voters tend to say that it was a good experience, they're happy with the quality, and they view the election with integrity. So voters themselves are often very, very happy with the quality of elections. The people who are not happy with the quality of elections are people who are not voting, right? People who do not go to the voting station, non-voters. So when you interview non-voters and you ask them about their electoral experience, you ask them about their opinion of the election commission, and you ask them about the quality of election results, they have a lot of criticism. And they will tell you about their concerns about the accuracy of the voting counts. They will tell you concerns about voting irregularities. They will express distrust about the election commission and election results. And indeed, it is amongst these non-voters that dissatisfaction with the voting system and concerns about electoral irregularities are very, very high. Indeed, there's a frequent belief amongst certain cohorts of this population that wealthy people buy elections, that voters are bribed, that voters are intimidated by violence, and that votes are not accurately counted. So this shows us there's a real crisis of faith amongst a significant group of voters in South Africa about the integrity of elections. It's important to realize that while negativity around elections is slightly higher in KZN than other parts of the country, it is not a lot higher. Indeed, this, however, may change as the MK challenges the election results of the 2024 MPE, and maybe will rally its voters in support of this anti-election commission narrative. So what can be done regarding this matter? How can we turn around growing disillusion with democracy, and how can we try and fix some of the things that are wrong with our current democratic system? Well, firstly, we must realize that the 2024 MPE took place in one of the most disillusioned, discontented political moods we've observed since 1994. The public opinion data will tell you that people were remarkably disillusioned during this period, and they had increasingly critical evaluations of electoral democracy. Indeed, based on these critical evaluations, we were able to predict the low turnout scenario that actually occurred in 2024 and identified political discontent and disillusionment as the main reasons for electoral absenteeism, which is consistent with research the human science research has done since 2009. I don't know, I'm not sure why it keeps doing this, but I'm almost done, so it's fine. So the main causes of our problem with electoral democracy are demand side. And they come from people's disillusionment with the system. They come from people wanting a better system, a need for greater civic mindedness and civic engagement. So one of the things we need to do to restore faith in our democratic system is to restore faith in the election commission, debunk information that is spurious about electoral fraud and spurious allegations of electoral miscounting. We need to strengthen funding for the election commission in this regard, specifically around civic education. In terms of civic education, we need to focus on the duty to vote, the power of voting, and particularly on getting people to view elections as a way to drive political action and political change. Many people who want political change don't view elections in this fashion. Right? Duty-bound citizenship is the key to ensuring and promoting democracy, which means we need to target fatalism among citizens and recognize the growing demand for political accountability in the country. So I just want to apologize again for the slides. It seems to be moving on its own. I'm really not sure why, but thank you so much. I look forward to any questions you may have. This is the broader team from ASSAf, and I just want to thank them in particular for allowing this presentation to be possible. So I am again sorry about the slides. They seem to be moved on their own a little bit there. But thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Stephen, for a very interesting and insightful presentation. We'll come back to questions, and colleagues, please put questions into the chat box and the QA. Sorry, there's a Q&A box there, and we will raise those questions after the second presentation. I now have the privilege and the pleasure of introducing our second speaker, Dr. Nkapeli Nkunu, who's also from the Human Science Research Council. He holds a PhD from the University of Stellenbosch, and his areas of interest overlap with mine. He's looking at democratic quality, corruption, governance, and public accountability and service delivery. Dr. Nkunu, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Maharaj. I am going to begin sharing my screen within the next 2 seconds. Please do let me know if it is appearing. Full presentation mode. Thank you very much. Is my presentation showing on the screen?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Once again, it is an absolute pleasure. I'd just like to reiterate Dr. Gordon's sentiments. It is an absolute pleasure to present before the panel today. Thank you for the invite and opportunity.
Sorry, if you can just put it onto presentation mode, you.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
So my presentation focuses on something that probably has essentially formed quite a key or core part of South Africa's democracy in the last 15 years or so, and that relates to corruption and democratic dissatisfaction or democratic regression. So we are just looking at how has corruption and misinformation affected South Africans and their views on democracy, looking at the dominance of the African National Congress between 2004 and up to 2024, a 20-year period. So I think first we need to try and understand why are we having these discussions regarding democracy. Democracy, of course, is the most popular form of governance across the world. However, we have begun to see continuing dissatisfaction across the global south and the global north. We've also seen a return to far-right extremism. We've begun seeing a few countries, particularly in Africa, suffering or experiencing coups, which may have underestimated all the work or the progress that the continent was making in terms of securing and building a stable democracy across the continent. So we have begun to see how is this happening? What is going on with democracy? Of course, one of the prominent scholars, Larry Diamond, has also pointed out that there has been a continuing decrease in democracy, across the world. And also, Sam Huntington also alludes that there have been 30 countries who transitioned to democracy, and most of those, of course, include many African countries who transitioned into democracy 30, 35 years ago. However, we are now beginning to see a bit of a decline, and the momentum that democracy had has started to fade. Now, when we look at corruption in South Africa, from a conceptual standpoint, it is a contested concept, but there are many scholars such as Robert Clickard and Dr. Kaufman, Professor Kaufman, who focuses and specializes state capture, who basically define corruption as the process of one gaining state resources for private gain. But in South Africa, we try and take it a step further, because as the HSRC, we have been trying to track South Africa's views on core issues, including satisfaction in service delivery, education, corruption, xenophobia, and all those matters that form part of our daily discourse within the country. We've begun to see a shift, particularly in the last 20 years, with the increase of corruption being recognized as a most important problem. So in our SASA survey, we've got an open-ended question where we ask our respondents, according to you, what do you think is South Africa's most important problem? Or what do you think is the biggest problem, or is the most pertinent problem? And when we filled that question in 2003, only about 20% or 10% of our respondents had recognized corruption as a top 3 problem. However, as of 2021-22, it has shot up to 36%, and we have been undertaking analysis, and it seems like it is still increasing, but it's despite it decreasing for a year or two, something we attributed it to be about the Ramaphoria that we had during that period. But there's also great literature which speaks about the impact of corruption as an endemic in a democracy. So the aim of this research was to understand the relationship between corruption, perceptions of corruption, responses to corruption, and ultimately, what does it mean for a democracy? So we are all aware of the 2016 state of capture report that was released by Professor Thuli Madonsela, who was public protector at the time. In this report, it was alleged that there certainly was evidence of state capture, and as part of the recommendations that the public protector offered, effectively form a commission which would investigate further into these allegations of state capture and corruption. So, of course, that is how then we ended up with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, or Judicial Inquiry into State Capture. However, during that period, and the more South Africa's problems of corruption continue, we've seen a further increase in misinformation and populism. This rapid rise in populism has been quite aggressive, particularly on social media and on platforms that are not necessarily regulated. There's also terms, including, for example, Stellenbosch Mafia, radical economic transformation, clever blacks, white monopoly capital, and etc. Now, the misinformation and populism element of this aggressive strategy is not that there aren't any economic disparities or economic inequality in the country. For example, when one speaks about white monopoly capital, of course there is. And many studies within the country, within the continent, and internationally seek to establish exactly how one can go about reducing that kind of inequality. However, the populism and misinformation somewhat attempts to justify state capture as a response or as an equalizer to the inequality or the economic inequality that we see in South Africa. This, of course, is also part of a strategy to target certain people who are seen to be most vocal. Former public protector Thuli Madonsela was also attacked personally for her views and for her stance on state capture and for her unwillingness to essentially abandon her duty, which is protected by the Constitution. Now, how are we tracking all of this? So we've got the South African Social Attitude Survey that Dr. Gordon spoke to earlier. So as he did mention that we run a national survey. It is nationally representative, and it has been going since 2003. We've also been able to look at several key factors, as I said earlier on, that are topical for South Africans. But we've also got online surveys that look to speak to particular pertinent issues at the time. We had an online survey, for example, looking at democracy and COVID, looking at responses to the COVID-19 nationwide lockdown. We've had online surveys looking at youth electoral participation and online surveys looking at the Zondo Commission as well. So these are all the type of public opinion studies that we have been doing as the HSRC, and it has enabled us to kind of get a much greater understanding of people's views on corruption. Presently, Dr. Gordon is leading a project that we are working on with one of our key partners, where we are trying to get a more qualitative and in-depth insights and understanding of corruption, the reasons for corruption, and the norms of corruption in terms of our ethical inclinations as a people. So those are some of the studies we have been working on and we have been undertaking in the area. Now, we've got the dominant party system. What is a dominant party system? So the dominant party system essentially is a system whereby a country has been governed by a political party for 3 or 4 elections, or for 3 or 4 electoral terms, and in that period there has not been any disrupted power cycle. So, for example, in South Africa, we did have the dominant party system up until 2024, as we now have the coalition-induced government of national unity. So essentially, the dominant party system means that one party achieves overwhelming influence in terms of policy, in terms of electoral participation. And of course, this is something we saw with the African National Congress, particularly in 2004, where the party nearly amassed 70% of the electoral votes. Now, what does this mean? So the dominant party system essentially means that parties can make or do particular things without necessarily getting pushback from the state governance and site institutions. But of course, there are advantages to dominant party systems, one of which has to do with the stability that one party can offer or provide. Now, this stability is usually because there isn't a power shift between, say, maybe a party from between a leader from party A to party B. So that stability makes it much easier for countries to transition. But Professor Robert Greene also talks about the resource-driven dominance. Now, the resource-driven dominance is essentially the fact that dominant parties who are governing in a dominant party system have undeterred and uninterrupted access to state resources. And these state resources may be used for reasons either than governance. It can be used for party reasons. For example, we had a case in 2020 where a SANDF helicopter was said to have transported members of the African National Congress. And of course, those provisions are only allowed for a president who is obviously the head of state, and his security detail is always basically working for as long as he is on the move. However, for others, that is simply not permissible. But also, one of the dangers of the dominant party system is what happened with the shutting down of the Scorpions. Post Polokwane 2007, the African National Congress had resolved to shut down the Scorpions, and because of their overwhelming majority, they were able to do that. And although cases Glenister 1 and 2 would later on determine that the shutting down of the Scorpions was in fact unconstitutional, because of the sheer dominance that the ANC had at the time, it was able to do so, and we are where we are today regarding that. So now, just quickly to take you through some of the things we have looked at, particularly in relation to concerns of corruption and living standards. We are finding that more and more people seem to believe that certain things have gotten worse in the last 5 years. So, for example, if we look at corruption, we saw that nearly 3/4 of the people we had interviewed had said that corruption had gotten worse in the last he said corruption had gotten worse in the last 5 years. This was also the case for crime and safety, cost of living, and unemployment. Now, we have also seen that because of the negative effects and the perceived negative effects of corruption, it leads to a country not being trusted as much, particularly core state institutions, something that Dr. Gordon spoke to in his presentation. We also now look also at future prospects. When you look at future prospects, we begin to see that there is huge dissatisfaction, particularly with core services. So, for example, there is huge dissatisfaction with the creating employment opportunities, reducing crime, and providing affordable housing. However, when we look to the right, there is also that sense of despondency, because people do not believe that things will get better. So, for example, well over 2/3 of our respondents said that corruption will not improve in the next 5 years. If anything, it'll get worse. While there's slightly more than half of our participants had said that service delivery and service delivery provisions would get worse in the next 5 years. We then look at some of the key evaluation and measures of democracy. So, for example, we looked at what South Africans think regarding their freedom to criticize the government, for example. 62% of them recognize its importance. Only 58% said it is actually applicable in South Africa. We also have, when we look at below the second indicator from below, or from the bottom, where we ask ruling parties are punished in elections when they've done a bad job. 63% of our participants I recognize this importance. However, only 42% believe that it actually does happen. So now, why is this important? This is important because it is also tied into the belief or the perception that corruption and other misdeeds are not punished. Then we look, for example, at how do these things now affect citizen duties and norms. So, for example, do people still agree that they have a duty to vote? We are finding that over time, the duty to vote and this type of efficacy has dropped significantly between 2003 and 2021 and 2022. And one of the reasons for that has to do, we have established with one, dissatisfaction with democracy as a whole, but two, also increasing distrust and dissatisfaction with efforts and measures in place to reduce or get rid of corruption. We've also now got the belief regarding intention to vote. And a similar picture emerges. Despite it peaking at nearly 3/4 of 74% in 2004, it continued to plummet and reached a new low of 35% in 2021. And our analysis and data also shows that it has continued to decrease in 2022 and 2023. This also explains the lowest national turnout we had of the recently concluded national elections. Now, we look at reasons. Why are people saying they will not vote? So we've got administrative barriers, we've got queues, disinterest, and disillusionment. So the disinterest and disillusionment is the most important one here, because as we can see, it is highlighted in red, and it has increased over time. So the share of the sample population who highlighted this particular reason as an incentive or as a reason for them not to participate has increasingly gotten worse over time. Since 2013, which was, of course, 11 years ago, it's been at over 3/4 at 77%, 77% in 2018, 79% in 2021. So all the hopelessness and the despondency that is caused by several other challenges creates an impression that whether or not people vote, it does not make a difference because their votes are not going to produce any form of change. Now, when we look at the analysis, we begin to see that there is a clear disillusionment with South Africa's democracy. We've also seen reduced trust in core institutions, as Dr. Gordon highlighted. This includes, of course, Parliament and national local government. Local government becomes particularly important because of its importance and proximity when it comes to service delivery. But the decline has also not just been limited to government. It has been extended to state institutions. Why is that the case? Because even the courts, despite their relatively impressive track record, they too have suffered the pull-down effect. So the pull-down effect is simply a matter of the participants not being able to discern whether or not this institution is worth trusting and this institution is not worth trusting. So we are now finding a situation whereby, because of the low trust we are seeing, South Africans are likely to just be non-trusting and ultimately do not have faith in any of the key institutions. There is a difference, as Dr. Gordon mentioned, between the pre-experience and the post-experience. For example, with the Electoral Commission, even though trust in general was quite low, those who would have went to vote and participated in one of our key studies, which is the Election Satisfaction Survey, they tend to have a much more positive assessment of the commission. This is also not limited to the commission only. It is also limited to the South African National Defence Force. We have seen a similar trend emerge as well. However, because of the perceptions that would have been developed, it becomes difficult for citizens to discern on their levels of trust and who they trust the most and who they trust the least. Now, part of the dominant party system and what it does is that the failures of a party are always tied to the failures of democracy as a whole. Now, that is particularly important because it is critical that South Africans remain aware of their democratic right. A democracy cannot be deemed to have failed when it has only ever had one party be governed. But because of the dominance, those are the senses and that is the belief that South Africans tend to have. And this becomes critical when we consider the fact that South Africans are more likely to stay away rather than go and give another party a chance should they be unhappy with their preferred party. Now, the voting age participation has been increasing and it's continuing. It's going to increase over time. And as Dr. Gordon said, it was quite fairly easily predictable that this year's elections were going to have a low turnout because of all the factors that we have been tracking between 2019 and 2024. Now, we do need to, of course, mention that not voting in particular, and that is what we found in the study, that not voting is not necessarily the solution. However, ours, of course, is not to tell people what to do. Rather, it is to try and provide information and make sure that everything is contextualized, particularly in the era and times of misinformation, propaganda, and populism. So just in closing, we definitely, as a country, are running the risk of having a democracy that will not necessarily have the legitimacy of having been approved or given a stamp of approval by citizens as a whole. The number of citizens who did not vote in this year's elections are estimated to be at 11 million. I speak on correction. However, that was the figure I last recall. That 11 million is quite important because it is such a huge number. And one of the key prerequisites for a healthy democracy is that there needs to be some form of legitimacy and there needs to be some form of acceptance that this democracy does represent the will of the people. So because of the continued dissatisfaction with the ruling party, which of course has had many scandals relating to corruption, and even though South Africa's democracy and constitutional democracy is quite progressive and firm in its belief or in its encouraging of the rule of law, oversight institutions, and accountability, we are not seeing that come through from the voter side. And as a result, they are continuing to be dissatisfied with corruption, whilst also deciding not to exercise their right or their power of the vote. And with that, I'd like to draw my presentation to a close. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to any questions that we may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mkhunu, for a very interesting presentation. Colleagues, we've had two fascinating analysis of participation in elections, levels of apathy, and especially one of the reasons was linked to corruption. I'm hoping that you're going to throw some questions on the chat, and then Raj from the office will help guide me through that. But I want to pose a few questions or comments to Stephen and Kapeli and Kapeli to initiate a discussion. I think one of the issues, Stephen, when you talk about the 2023 social attitude survey, I'm assuming that that was conducted before the rise of the MK party. You know, you focus quite a bit on how KZN is different. One of the reasons is linked to the role of the former president, Jacob Zuma, and then his subsequent, what's the word, launching of this party. I think it was in December 2023. So I'm not sure whether you consider that factor during this. I'm assuming the survey was done before that party was formed, but I stand to be corrected. But the other issue that I don't think you've alluded to directly, and I think Dr. Mkhunu was talking about that. If you're looking at the trust in the IEC in particular, and kind of a chorus somehow saying that the 2024 elections were rigged and must be challenged, this noise is actually coming from social media, and is obviously very loud and vociferous in certain circles. And I wanted you to comment on how that influences public opinion, and especially disinformation, and what Dr. Mkhunu was talking about as populism. And with regard to the non-participation or the reduction in voter participation and the lack of confidence or faith in democratic processes, you make the important point, Stephen, that civil society should be doing a lot more in terms of education, etc. And I saw some comment about that the faith sector should have been doing more. Even with regard to corruption, you know, if you ask the question, who sets the moral tone? Who's the moral authority in South Africa? So it's clearly not Parliament. You know, the Parliament looks at legalities, etc. But you know, the moral authority comes from the faith sector, and the reason I'm referring to the faith sector is that 90%, I think the last elections, at least certainly over 80%, last census said that they were actively religious. And we all know that South Africa is an actively religious country, and therefore you would expect, you know, greater moral conduct, etc., a greater sense of honesty and integrity amongst us. And I'm connecting this in Kapeli with regard to corruption. As we are speaking now, I think you know, there's a group of parliamentarians being swearing, taking the oath to serve the country. Some of them are being presently have been charged, so they are appearing in court. We have a impeached judge who's not going to lead the opposition in parliament. So what does it say about our own moral conduct and the way it would appear that corruption is actually a badge of honor? So those are the comments I'm opening up with, and I want Dr. Gordon and Dr. Mkunu to respond, and then we've got time for more discussion. Over to you, guys. I think
well, thank you
Stephen can
very, very
start.
much, Prof. With Dr. Mchuna's blessing, let me respond first, if that's okay.
Yes, go for it.
Thank you very much. So obviously, you are very correct that this data was gathered before the rise of the MK party, which, as you know, is a very recent party. But I think what the data shows is that KwaZulu-Natal was particularly ripe for the rise of the MK because the MK was able to take advantage of remarkably high disillusionment and discontent with the status quo to draw support away from the ruling party and towards itself. Obviously, that's not the only factor at play here, because we do see declining levels of satisfaction with the status quo outside KZN. But I think it's very, very clear if you look at the data on KZN that the environment was particularly ripe for an outside candidate to come in and drive voters away from the ruling parties as some new type of political entity. Now that the MK is kind of formed and it has supporters and infrastructure, it's much easier to study. And I'm sure there will be many studies of the MK party and its, who are its supporters, what do they want, what is their nature and character in the coming, months and years. But, this data was obviously just shows you why something like the MK was more likely in KwaZulu-Natal than in maybe some other provinces. I want to talk a little bit about where people get their information on elections and where people get their information about voting. So if you ask people where they get their information from, they will tell you that they get their information from the broadcast media, particularly television. That's the main thing they put forward. Only a small share of people will tell you that they get their information from social media and the internet. And then if you ask them where they prefer to get their information from, again, the broadcast media. People in particularly find television and radio very easy to use, and they tend to put forward television and radio when you ask them. Young people are a little different. Young people increasingly are choosing social media, and we do see a large rise as you see a lot of social media penetration. The main way that disinformation, however, spreads in South Africa is through WhatsApp groups and through other similar private messaging apps in which people will share something that looks very legitimate, and then it will be shared between WhatsApp groups or other forms of groups and becomes very, very popular within that network of communication. So people often believe they're sharing a legitimate news item. Very often it's fake news to their sort of friends and family and neighbors and what have you. And that's one of the main ways that disinformation gets spread, and these sort of false narratives about elections and electoral integrity become very, very prominent very, very quickly within those networks and then spill over into the wider sphere. And that's very difficult to monitor and contain, because unlike something like Twitter or Facebook, it's harder for external monitors to sort of gauge WhatsApp traffic. So that has to be put into context. We are in many ways faced with a new reality in South Africa following these elections. It was quite an upset to our existing political system, and I think we're all trying to get a grip of what this means looking forward. It might be that the excitement of the national unity government sort of shakes people out of a certain complacency and despondency that they have. Now that they see that, change of a character is more likely because we have seen a large-scale change, then they may feel more inclined to participate in the system. So this will be a real test of that, and whether the government of national unity can indeed convince people that it is a break from the past, that it is a new face, that it has priorities that will address the many issues that make South Africans very, very unhappy. So I think I will leave it there. I know some of your other questions were more directed at Kapeli, so maybe I will turn it over to him and he can answer on his side.
Thank you. Over to Kapeli.
Sure. Thanks, Prof. Thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. So if I may, just quickly speak on the MK-KZN matter. I think when we analyze the province of KZN, we see two things. One, it is a fairly fluid province in the sense that since 1994, there've been, I think, 3 now with the MK political parties who gained the most votes between 1994, 94 and 99. It was the IFP. Then 2004, it was the ANC, and then obviously 2009 when Jacob Zuma took over, it was the ANC, and then ultimately with nearly 2/3 in the province in 2014. However, the opposition parties have also changed. So when the decline of the IFP in the province took place between 2009 and 2014, and in 2014, it was dislodged by the Democratic Alliance as the official opposition in KZN. But also they had suffered significant losses in 2011 due to the rise of the National Freedom Party by the late Zanele Magwaza. Now, whilst there is fluidity, but there is also a habit and a willingness to vote based on who they see who looks or seems familiar. That is why the voting discourse or the KZN discourse regarding tribalism or tribal voting has also been quite a key discussion post the elections. Now, there are certainly elements of tribalism, but it is not as simple and straightforward as tribalism and to say that it's just tribalism and that's it. Jacob Zuma is quite aware of the provincial dynamics, and he too knows what it's like to lose power in the province. If you will remember, in the 2016 local government elections, aside from the mini metros and the Jesus coming back in 2016, Nkandla was secured by the IFP, which is obviously Zuma's home village. So the voters in KZN have been fluid, and they've shown a willingness to swap votes. You see this as well with the economic freedom fighters who had grown the most in the province in 2019. They had gone from just under 2% to 9-10%. But because of the MK and other factors this year, they have been, they've essentially lost all the ground that they'd made between 2019 to 2024. Now, with regards to corruption and the society we are becoming, I think, Prof, it goes back to the kind of leaders and leadership we as a country have put forward and have advanced. This may not be something that scholars agree on. However, the leader or the person you have leading the country will always have to be exemplary in their behavior. Now, what we began to see is not that corruption in South Africa started in 2009. No, they would be dishonest. However, the normalizing and the institutionalizing and the defending and justifying through misinformation, through populism, through propaganda of corruption began under former President Jacob Zuma's term of office. This was done, of course, we are all aware of the Bell Pottinger and the justification of those ESCOM contracts and many other across SOEs. And this is something his supporters and his backers have run with. And because in South Africa, we are not necessarily a highly engaged country with an ability to discern in terms of the information we consume, it became much easier for people to believe. Now it has almost gotten to a point whereby he is framed as this person who was essentially fighting white monopoly capital and trying to advance the agenda of Black people. He has been able to portray this image predominantly because of misinformation. And now when you see the impeached Judge John Thorpe heading to the MK, he too will pursue a very similar line. What he will do is he will start making it seem as if he was removed because he was fighting monopoly capital or because Zondo or someone. So once those things start happening and spreading and they are not regulated, particularly on social media, you may have a segment of the population who does not necessarily understand how detrimental and destructive corruption can be, particularly for a country with lofty developmental ambitions as South Africa. Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, thank you, Nkapeli. I'm going to go to the chat. We've got time for another round of questions. There's one question from Leslie Swart. Is it possible to assess to any degree the impact of anti-democratic processes from other countries on South Africa, I'm assuming? All of us are bombarded with attacks on election by Trump, for example, and this has been a huge thing in the past few years. So many people get their information only on the internet, which is dominated by global players. So I'm going to just read out the questions, and then I think between Nkapeli and Stephen, you all can decide how to respond, right? There's another question. International Corruption Perception Index indicates that corruption has become entrenched in South Africa. We have constantly fallen in the ranking, currently 41 out of 44 in 2021. What does this indicate regarding the government leadership and ability to prosecute perpetrators? Yeah, I was going to raise that, Nkapeli, the issue of the failure of the NPA. And maybe you want to comment briefly on that.
Yes.
Then a related question, can a multi-party government or the GNU decrease corruption? I think there's going to be more pressure on accountability, but I'd like to hear Nkapeli's views. Given the results of our recent elections, are South Africans moving beyond party loyalty when voting? Yeah, I think that's very clear. The MK and Jacob Zuma, we've addressed that. Voting day was a public holiday, but all retail stalls were open. With what happened to be a full staff complement, would this have impacted on the voter turnout, so being a holiday? Remember the long queues and people were standing for long. I stood for 3 hours to vote. And then the last one on my list, it's from, I think, Mavis. I can't see the name clearly here. Although the leading party lost a lot of votes, they continue to obtain a high number of votes in rural areas. Any idea on what influences people in these areas to remain committed despite the fact they receive the worst end of service delivery and employment opportunities? Yeah, those are broad questions, and Stephen and Nkapeli, y'all decide how to respond. You might want to comment on all, actually. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Prof. Let me respond to some of the questions, and then I will turn it over to Nkapeli. So firstly, on the issue of the impact of the democratic recession in other nations and on South Africa, we must remember that while the South African middle class, to a certain extent, is quite exposed to information happening outside the borders of the country, The vast majority of South Africans are quite insular in their public opinion, and their knowledge of the comings and goings of, say, the recent European Union elections or the run-up to the elections in the United States, or snap elections in France, or snap elections in Britain, are very circumscribed and probably do not play a very important or significant role on their the formation of their political views and their political attitudes. When you ask people and look at the data, it really seems that people's attitudes are formed very much by their own immediate conditions and their evaluations of the nation as a whole. In terms of why people vote the way that they do, what we've seen historically in South Africa is that people award the party that they like with votes, and if they are unhappy with a political party or with the conditions, then they don't tend to vote. They tend to stay home. And this is partially the reason for declining voter turnout, is that people who were, say, in 2004, in 1999, in 1994, they were, very happy with the African National Congress. They felt the African National Congress was doing a good job. They turned out in large numbers to vote for the African National Congress. As the people became more disillusioned with the African National Congress, they tended to stay home. There are a minority of voters who are definitely swing voters who do tend to change up their vote, and we do see this. We saw this a lot with local government elections and with the recent NP, the recent national government election. However, again, this is the vast majority of voters are not swing voters. This may change. Again, political trends do tend to reach a tipping point moment, and then you see quite dramatic shifts. We've seen this in a lot of countries in the last 10 years. Particularly, you can think about Argentina, France, Mexico, as prime examples where existing political status quos, which have been locked in for long periods of time, were shaken up and changed dramatically overnight. So again, political trends that we observe now are not locked in and do not stay. A lot of the failure to see more political shift in South Africa has to be attributed to the opposition, who have not found the right narrative to convince voters to move away from parties they've been loyal to but are very unhappy with, to new parties with maybe better ideas. Indeed, it's not that voters are happy with the status quo and content with the way things going. That's not what the data suggests. What the data suggests is that opposition parties, whoever they may be, have not found the correct narrative to really inspire people to change their political voting habits. And that really is the key. Again, the government of national unity might break through this morass and convince people that by supporting one political party or the other, they can see large change. It really, I feel, depends on a lot on how the government of national unity does in its first term. Now we'll turn it over to Gopali. I know he would like to comment on some of the corruption questions, but also some of the questions about MK. He recently has finished a chapter on the MK, which will be published quite soon.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. Yes, so with regards to the corruption perceptions index, yes, South Africa has been scoring quite low. And even with the Transparency International measuring tool, you can see where the shift, starts. And of course, at the height of state capture, that 2015, 16, 17 period, of course, corruption essentially became probably the most discussed issue within the South African democratic sphere. So and even when you look at, for example, Afrobarometer, it has also spilled over to current President Ramaphosa in terms of the belief that not enough is being done to get rid of corruption or to deal with corruption decisively. So those perceptions are something that it'll take a while for them to turn if citizens feel that enough is being done with regards to corruption and getting rid of corruption. In my humble opinion, there definitely is, or there are a few things being done, and it also ties into the matter of the NPA. We all saw the destruction that took place in the NPA, where key investigators, prosecutors were basically purged, and of course, we all saw at the commission where both Lawrence Mrebi and Nomdebo Jiba were essentially found guilty to have been undermining all processes in the NPA and obviously trying to advance a particular narrative or agenda. This is also similar to what we saw in the Najan Commission. And with the Najan Commission, we effectively saw clear detail and information of how under Tom Moyane, SARS was essentially just stripped to the bones, and more than 2,000 highly skilled and competent people had to leave the institution because they were being purged and because they were essentially not being allowed to do their jobs. Now, all of those factors have kind of played a role in what we are seeing today. In the case of SARS under Edward Kisweta, who's also who's just signed a 2-year extension, we've seen SARS starting to turn the corner. The institution is starting to function well again. And that speaks to the political will of the person who's in charge, or the president. The same goes as well with the NPA. Advocate Batoyi did make the acknowledgement that President Ramaphosa has not interfered in the functioning or the processes of the NPA. However, because of the institutional degradation that the NPA essentially suffered, it has become far more difficult for the NPA to secure secure convictions of corruption, because the highly skilled and competent individuals they had were essentially lost during the height of the peak of state capture. So those are all the kind of factors we need to keep in mind, or we do need to pay attention to when assessing institutions like the NPA. But the proclamations, for example, of the Special Investigative Units, my colleague and I, Gary Pina, made submissions last week as to how the SIU can improve on certain things, particularly focusing on Pillar 6. So there seems to be a willingness for these institutions to do their job. And what are we beginning to see? We are seeing more high-profile individuals being charged for corruption. We saw just before the elections, we saw the Speaker of Parliament, who was obviously a member of the African National Congress, a senior member. We saw Ace Makashule as well over the asbestos saga. We saw the former Zizi, who was at Sports, Arts and Culture. He appeared last week. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that there does seem to be a willingness and an ability of these institutions to quote unquote arrest or hold accountable the so-called big fishes who were ordinarily would be viewed or deemed as untouchable. So there's that will to make sure that institutions are working. However, what isn't there, which we had previously during the times of the Scorpion and highly effective anti-corruption mechanisms, is capital. Because the country does not have the kind of resources that we put into the Scorpions, into the the national the prosecution teams, that is no longer there. So while there does seem to be a sense or a willingness from particularly President Ramaphosa, Minister Lamula, and Deputy Minister Nel who have been fast-tracking some of the bills, or one of the key bills, which would help essentially reestablish somewhat of what the Scorpions was. However, the financial capacity, the financial resources may not necessarily be as easy to access. So it may take a bit of time. And just one last point, we will, of course, always remember that Jonas Sishinja did say that the people who benefited from state capture will never go down without a fight. And Professor William Gumede wrote in his 2005 book regarding Thabo Mbeki and the soul of the ANC, essentially, that is exactly what has happened now with Cyril Ramaphosa and the soul of the ANC. Now, as a country, obviously, due to the dominant party system, we find ourselves being so invested in ANC politics because inevitably they would have an effect on our well-being as a country, irrespective of whether or not we vote for them. Which then brings me to the point regarding the government of national unity. The government of national unity definitely has an opportunity to turn the corner when it comes to fighting corruption. But equally, the government of national unity runs the risk of essentially being boggled down to things that do not necessarily matter, or worrying about things that do not necessarily have to worry about. Like, for example, we all saw the media and the news yesterday regarding positions and etc. and etc. So what we may begin seeing now would be certain departments or certain institutions not being given the kind of support they would ordinarily have in order for them to work or to do their job professionally, effectively, and without any political interference. So, for example, if we look at the justice cluster, and of course with the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development, that has been a key department in many of the reforms that we've seen taking place under President Ramaphosa and Minister Lamula. However, we do not have any guarantees that those kinds of initiatives would continue. They may continue at a more rapid pace, but they may not. And because of the relationship between politics and governance and the blurred lines, it may be difficult for President Ramaphosa to effectively give up those kinds of institutions, because he may also not feel like the people that he has in his corner will be protected. And ultimately, that is what it comes down to. It comes down to with how far are you willing to go to fight corruption. For example, one of Ramaphosa's biggest backers is the Premier of the Eastern Cape. The Premier of the Eastern Cape is also, in trouble at the moment, and the proclamations from the SIU may go off at any time. Now, with Mabuyane, for example, heading into 2027, and as we've seen the importance of the Eastern Cape now in particular, the importance of the Eastern Cape as a party for the ANC heading into conference season in 2027, we do not know whether or not he will be held accountable, not preempting whether or not he's guilty, but there is a matter that hangs before him. We do not know whether or not they will fully pursue that matter ahead of 2027. And if they don't, what then does it say about the commitment that the ANC or Ramaphosa seems to have made a pledge dating back to 2017 that his campaign is based on clean governance and anti-corruption. So I think those are some of the issues that the government of national unity may face, but it is also an opportunity for them to essentially correct the previous injustices when it comes to anti-corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngapeli. Very comprehensive response. I just wanted to add, we're looking at the rise of corruption. I think my memory tells me it was under the Mandela regime when the so-called Sarafina scandal. I think it was around 1998. It was peanuts. If you're looking at it in terms of billions, it was about 16 million rands, etc. And the other case that emerged during the Mbeki era was the Travelgate scandal. These were MPs were running a racket with travel agents and claiming for travel, which they don't do, and they got some kickback. And why I'm mentioning both cases is no one was prosecuted. And to Mandela's credit, I believe he reflected after and he acknowledged that he should have been harsher in the way in which they dealt with the Sarafina scandal. And just to bring it to the contemporary era, as you most probably know and most probably following this case, the case of the former mayor, Zandile Gumede, in the Devon High Court, where the latest is that the city had employed the services of a forensic auditor to gather the evidence. And now that the case is running, apparently the forensic auditor's services have been terminated. And there's a view that this is part of a political strategy to sabotage the case. Once again, the possibility is that someone who's clearly fingered in corruption may get away scot-free. We're coming to the end. I think this is a tongue-in-cheek comment. I'm going to read it out. Irvi Gledel. Should sources of evidence-based information adopt the same tactics as sources of misinformation? Well, those of us who depend on information and scientific information cannot deviate from that path, right? The last question comes from Melusi Twala, is addressed to Dr. Mkunu. Dr. Mkunu talked about declining societal duty in the voting process. I would like to ask, what would cause people to believe that their vote brings about change? Is our declining trust also driven by the South African voting system? I want to add to that is, there's talk about us having to relook at our electoral system and to shift from a PR system where loyalty is to the party to look at a constituency-based system where there's greater accountability to the voters. And some of you may recall there was a Slavitt Commission appointed under the Mbeki leadership, and somehow it's ended up in cold storage. Your views, Dr. Mkunu?
Yes, thank you, Prof. And yes, I'm happy to respond. So with the Sarafina scandal and the Trevor Cook scandal, they're absolutely right that there was virtually no accountability. And particularly, even when you look at the arms deal and see commission findings, which were later set aside after Henny van Vuren and Lewis from Corruption Watch essentially went to court to ask the court to set aside those findings. And when we look, for example, at how former President Mbeki handled the removal or the suspension of Advocate Vusi Pikoli, who had been declared to be fit and proper to continue in his role as the National Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, but because of his pursuit of Jackie Selebi, he essentially was removed. So that all laid the groundwork for what we would later see. And of course, it got far worse during that period of 2009 to 2018. It certainly did get far worse. It would be disingenuous to suggest that it didn't. However, it didn't just start then. There were certainly within the ANC, because even when you look at the matter of closing down the Scorpions, it was not even a highly debated matter. It was almost like, this is what we're doing, and yeah, it was fast-tracked, it was so quick, and before we knew it, it was over. So those are all the things that essentially led us here, and we do need to, the African National Congress, as you've correctly pointed out, Prof, former President Mandela did acknowledge that a lot of mistakes were made regarding to corruption, similar to the COVID corruption, when current President Ramaphosa wrote that ANC is suspect #1 when it comes to corruption. And former President Zuma wrote back and essentially told him that he cannot trial the ANC in public or in a public domain. So those are all the things now which essentially have shown us that it is quite clear that corruption is now at the heart and center of everything. So it's either you're for it or you're against it. If you're for it, you're on this side. If you aren't for it, you're on the other side. Now, of course, that leaves citizens the most vulnerable. Why? Because to the next question I go with regards to why do citizens feel like their vote will not make a difference? There's several explanations that speak to this, but one of the key ones that I have in trying to study electoral behavior is that in a lot of times South Africans' view of democracy is not necessarily based on the institution of democracy. Rather, it is mostly focused on service delivery. People just want service delivery. Everything else will follow later. And you see this with the reasons they give. For example, when you ask them, why are you not voting? They're not delivering their services. We do not have jobs. We do not have money. We do not have anything. So because if they view democracy as it's okay, look, this is a vehicle for me to go from A to B. And of course, the political parties also campaign on those kinds of sentiments. You know, they'll speak about housing, jobs, fixing the economy and stuff like that. Those are the kinds of bread and butter issues that South Africans in the majority tend to focus on. Now, if that is not delivered, or if that is seen to not be delivered, and the economy starts getting a bit unfriendly, particularly to the poorest of the poor, and the government is unable to cushion those who are battling financially, it leads to some form of frustration. However, as we've seen with the MK, what the MK were supposed to do, what the MK were able to do is go to these areas, go to all these communities within KZN who are disgruntled, and convince them to give MK an opportunity. Primarily why? Because it was quote unquote better under Jacob Zuma. That was the primary messaging. That was the populism. That was the easy, straightforward message that was being spread. Now, of course, people campaign how they campaign, but I do think that obviously that kind of populism seems to have worked, but it has also started to lose a bit of momentum, because if you look at the immediate by-elections that have taken place, post the elections, the MK have not done well at all. And we have seen, albeit anecdotally, many more people, even on social media, talking about they were actually misled, they did not know what the MK stands for, blah, 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 blah. Now, obviously, not everyone who voted the MK holds those sentiments. No, of course not. However, there is definitely a sense that the MK may have pulled a wool in front of in people's eyes. And the last one with regards to information tactics and for fighting corruption. Yes, I think the misinformation becomes very difficult one to counter because it's everywhere. And as Dr. Gordon said, a voice note will be circulated. It becomes so difficult for you to catch up with it. And also, what we are beginning to see is the tendency to not take matters to court, rather to take matters to the court of public opinion, because the court of public opinion is far less likely to be critical. We've seen this many times with the Zondo Commission and the reports. Many people who are implicated in the reports have said that the report is inaccurate, it's not factual, it's this and that, yet very few of them have actually taken it on review. So if someone believes that the report is not accurate or something was done unconstitutionally or procedurally flawed in how the evidence was gathered, they are able to take the report to our court of law. Our court of law will examine it, and then a decision will be made. But more often than not, it is going to be played out in the public domain, because there is a realization that in the courts, populism and propaganda will not cut it. Rather, they'd rather try discourage or undermine the credibility of the Zondo reports in the court of public domain, where it becomes more difficult for Zondo or the commission itself to defend itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nkapeli Mkhunu and Dr. Stephen Gordon, for amazing scholarly insights into electoral trends public opinions, and the connections with good governance and corruption. The closing remarks will be made by Professor Himla Sudyal, who's the CEO of ASSAf. Himla, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Maharaj. I am absolutely in awe of the breadth of knowledge that our speakers have shared with us today. I have learned an incredible amount, and I'm still trying to process what has been shared with us today. But Chair, first I want to convey a message from Professor Musa Moshabela, who seems to be in Ethiopia today. And unfortunately, wherever he is, there isn't a very good reception for internet connectivity. He has assured me that he tried to engage with the people hosting him, that he had the session today, and he was told that he would have connectivity, but unfortunately it's not working. So sincere apologies to the panelists and the chair from him. I'm sure I will try to engage with him at another point when we can hear some of his personal views on the topic. Chair, our colleagues on the panel really put into perspective the attitudes of the public. Dr. Gordon talked about the HSRC Social Attitude Survey from 2003 to 2023. And I guess this is the audience that we as the Academy of Science do our work to engage with. As you've mentioned earlier, Prof. Maharaj, that the Academy of Science is vested in the use of evidence-based science in the service of society. And our society is made up of many publics. And what we've heard today is the perception of the public when it comes to elections, our democracy, what their likes and dislikes are, and some of the issues such as corruption, crime, unemployment, cost of living, and other issues that affect the day-to-day lives of people that come into their psyche when asked their view on particular issues. So Dr. Gordon shared with us very interesting criteria from that survey, which is very reflective on what the perception of society is when it comes to the people in government who represent us as the society. Dr. Mkunu's presentation, boy oh boy, I mean, you are so well versed, standing on your feet, both of you, answering the questions and contributing to the dialogue. Really is a testament of your knowledge and expertise in this field. We as Academy have now to collectively view the public's opinion in terms of the issues that we consider that is our mandate to serve this society and this public. We are dealing with several issues of mistrust. I mean, you've heard it. 11 million or so people did not vote. And a lot of this may be, as Dr. Nkunu said, about what is a healthy democracy. Is our democracy taken for granted by the vast majority of the people? Does the democracy represent the will of the people? And so these are serious issues which allow us an insight into the psyche to which we as an academy try to deliver our own soundbite and our own mandate to society. What is the value of science? I am aware that the Department of Science and Innovation has asked the HSRC to conduct a survey on science engagement and the view of science in the public eye, and I'm still waiting to see that publication come out. But what is the value of science in all of this that we have been talking about? We are mandated as the Academy and other stakeholders within the national system of innovation to use science, technology, and innovation to address South Africa's challenges. We've heard about some of these challenges, and again, the challenges of corruption, of crime, of unemployment, cost of living. Now, when you try to bring science into this narrative, to what extent are people willing to hear the voice of science? We have these challenges with the politics. Now you want to bring science into that same foray and in that same landscape. How do we do it? Professor Maharaj talked about the issue of polycrisis, and many of you may have heard ASSAf talk about polycrisis previously. And the polycrisis is essentially looking at all of these global challenges and the way in which they are interconnected. And how is it that we could utilize this STI to harness a more robust way of addressing the polycrisis? And I believe that that is a sentiment that we will carry forward into our next 5-year plan as well. And the other issue, as has been shown by Dr. Gordon in some of his slides, that public perception is stratified by province in some instances. Now, as members of the National System of Innovation, we have also been tasked with talking about the 3 tiers of government. How do we bring our various activities addressing the white paper on science, technology, and innovation, talking about the implementation of the decadal plan in an environment where the local government, the provincial government, and national government ideas and participation needs to be taken cognizance of. These are very, very big challenges ahead of us. However, we have to keep positive, and it is about the low-hanging fruit. So from an academy perspective, having stakeholders and partners like those we've heard from the HSRC, we can work jointly in tackling the monster of the challenges we have in the country. Yes, this election has been very, very interesting. The percentage of voting, the splitting of the votes across political parties, and we just have to wait with bated breath to see how the and the GNU is going to come together to try to consolidate some of our political ways going forward, to kind of simmer, the small fires around the country, so that we can reintroduce the trust of the public in society and in the government. And once we start chipping in to getting much more positive sound bites from the public, then I think we will have a better way of bringing in the science and the way in which science can contribute towards solving some of these problems. Chairpersons, panelists, and people on the webinar, thank you ever so much for participating in this, one of the first in a series, as has been mentioned earlier, around us having some sort of evaluation of where we stand as a society 30 years post our democracy from 1994. I'm sure many of you still really relish in the memories of your first vote when you did have the vote as a democratic country in 1994 to where we are at present. Do we have the same thrills and excitements? Do we have more fears? Or what is it that guides us on our way forward? Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but we as a community of academics and scientists and people who want to create a positive environment for the way forward, I hope that you will continue to join us as the Academy in trying to chip away at the challenges we face in the country so that we can come out on the other side, no matter how many years it takes, in a reflective way that is much, much more positive than what we've heard today. Colleagues, thank you ever so much once again. And I just want to end by saying that while we as the Academy host such meetings, our duty is to bring together experts in the fields to share their insights, and these does not reflect the sentiments of the Academy per se. And so the views of the speakers are theirs, but we really thank them for sharing those with us, for instilling in our brains evidence-based science to mull over and to think about, and let us continue to engage in this way. Once again, thanks to Raj and my colleagues at the Academy, Henriette, Renata, Marvin, and Kolani, and anyone else in the background that I have missed, for whatever you've done to make this possible. All the best and have a good day forward. Bye for now.